So I don't know how much you know about Kable. We're an analyst firm. We just specialise in public sector ICT in the UK. And we've been doing that since 1990. Now, one of the things I love most about my job is the fact that the political landscape is so changeable, isn't it? And of course this changes the picture for you as technology companies who hope to supply the public sector. And of course the last few months have been particularly interesting, which is a rather neutral word to describe what's actually happened. And of course we know that there are going to be implications, but I want to start off, rather than looking ahead, just looking back a little bit. And in fact, I'd really like to go back into the dark ages. You know, important to understand where we're going in the context of where we've been, and you know, encourage you now to rack your memory. See if you. I'm going to talk about a couple of real dinosaurs now, important old figures in the government sphere. You know, apologies for those of you know these guys were around before most of you were born. You know, where are they now? But you know, these guys set the tone, didn't they, for all of the many changes we've seen to public sector IT over the last 5-6 years. And it's incredible to think that now, just within the space of a few months, how much the picture has changed, how much the political landscape has changed, and priorities changed too. So, but anyway, let's look back now to 2015, because when the majority Conservative government came in, it really solidified an agenda which had been kind of building really since 2010, which is all about austerity and public sector reform. So we remember, you know, when first David Cameron and Nick Clegg came in to talk about, you know, the kind of great work of their government, which was going to be about reducing the deficit, and this kind of sped up in 2015. Now this picture shows some of the tactics that government can use to reduce costs. Starting with, down here, sort of things that will get you kind of 2 to 3% annual savings over time. And you know what there is, you've got to sort of think in terms of a kind of a gradient, you know, with tactics becoming more and more radical as we get up to the top there. So down here, you know, a lot of the sort of stuff that the government was talking about were very much around shared back office support, shared service centres, you know, tweaking processes to get them a bit more efficient, doing better procurement, you know, renegotiating contracts, all that sort of stuff. And you know, a lot of that has happened since 2010. There's been a big agenda of public service reform which has really involved those kind of small efficiencies. But in fact, actually what we've also seen is that only gets you so far in terms of cost savings, and a government that was trying to get to, you know, eliminating the deficit by 2010, a hugely ambitious financial target, was always going to have to start going into much radical tactics in order to make those savings. Right up there where we're talking about, you know, actually withdrawing services completely. You know, we've all sort of seen the start of that, for example, libraries being closed and you know, adult social care coming under a lot of pressure. But you know, this is very much the kind of water in which we were all swimming in as technology suppliers, hoping to help the government. You know, it's very much around that story around austerity. Then what happened? Well, there was also a big piece in that which was around changing approaches to government IT particularly, and really interesting here to see such a kind of strong lead given by people like Mike Bracken and Liam Maxwell, supported by Francis Maud. There was a very clear agenda to reduce the influence of the large systems integrators. A lot of very kind of aggressive kind of cracking down on those suppliers in many ways. And you know, the idea was to increase competition in a number of ways, particularly increasing the number of small companies that government did business with, and also to, you know, to kind of shrink contracts. So they were a SME-friendly size. You know, your typical SME is not going to be in the Fujitsu business of going after multi-billion-pound contracts. So, you know, more contracts, smaller contracts, and particularly becoming more SME friendly. And we can see actually from this graph will show us actually how successful that policy has been. Back here in the dark ages, early 2000s, What we can see here, red line is the number of contracts put out that year, the blue line shows the value. Okay, and what we can see here, around 2000, 2005, small number of contracts, very, very high value. Okay, that was when government decided to outsource HMRC's IT to Capgemini in what was, we think, one of the biggest IT outsourcing contracts ever let anywhere in the world. Okay, so that was what government IT used to be about. But look, fast forward now to 2014, 2015, and we can see the number of contracts let every year has shot up. So there's lots more business out there. It's kind of turning over much more quickly, much more dynamic. And at the same time, the value is kind of coming right down. So the contracts are being put out in much smaller pieces. So it's a much more dynamic market, a lot more opportunity, a lot more kind of staging points at which you can kind of potentially get onto a government contract. So this is very interesting. Okay, so this has been the background the last kind of 6 years, but, you know, of course, then what happened? This happened. 23rd of June this year, we had the referendum. We all know the outcome. And, you know, this picture just shows that the sterling to dollar exchange rate, okay? And this shows just how responsive the markets are to kind of really quite in the big picture of things, but quite some individual items of news, all right? So we can see, you know, the referendum outcome, as soon as that was known, the value absolutely plunged right down to here, and it kept on falling, bottomed out in kind of early July. Went up a little bit as that immediate kind of political chaos seemed to subside a bit. We had a new Prime Minister put in place. The market seemed to be quite pleased at news that Brexit could be delayed till 2019. You know, the actual kind of discovery that there was no plan to deliver it, the markets actually seem to quite like that, which is interesting. And over here we can see more recently a little spike in the value as some of the early economic data suggested that, you know, maybe things weren't quite as bad as some had feared. But this very volatile picture in which the government is now operating in means that there has to be a big change in the kind of rhetoric that government ministers are using. Go on to, whoops. Interesting. Okay, well, no more slides. Golly, okay. Right, I feel a bit like the civil service on the 24th of June. Okay, so the point is that you know, the markets respond very quickly to what's going on in the political landscape at the time, and so of course there had to be that kind of change of emphasis. The new Prime Minister Theresa May was not coming in as part of a kind of planned transition. This wasn't a general election where the civil service knows that there could be a change and prepares. She was coming in to a country which politically, economically was you know, kind of in peril in a way, lots and lots of conflict, a constitutional crisis, different parts of the government, you know, the Scottish government, for example, you know, openly opposed, and great uncertainty. And so, of course, the need was to change the rhetoric. If you think about all that talk around austerity, had been really quite negative and depressing, hadn't it? It had all been around, you know, what we were going to cut, what we were going to stop doing. And you know, this is the absolute kind of worst tone to take if you want to stop a recession happening, which is very much about confidence. So that's why, if you remember when Theresa May stood on the steps of 10 Downing Street, you know, there wasn't a single mention of austerity. She talked about the need to promote growth, to increase productivity. She talked about how there have been lots of kind of public service reform, but not so much deep economic reform. So, you know, very kind of different change of rhetoric. And of course, you know, we know now that the government faces an incredibly challenging task. There was no plan for Brexit. Nobody expected the vote to go the way it did. And, you know, looking forward now, it seems kind of fairly clear that we are looking at a process which could take a decade more to complete. And there are also very many dependencies. So what I was about to show you just there before it died was a kind of complicated flow chart showing what's kind of potentially installed the next couple of years. And we have all of these points which may or may not happen, decisions which could go two ways. You know, we're still waiting for Article 50 to be triggered. You know, it's possible, it may not, it may be kind of kicked out further and further. You know, then you have this negotiating process. You know, the UK government does not have an agreed negotiating position yet. That's because there are internal divisions. Okay, so you know, a lot of debate between the camp which supports a so-called soft Brexit and that which supports a hard Brexit. Now, these two scenarios have very, very different implications in terms of what government would need to do, how government would look, the kind of functions it would need to perform. And looking further still, of course, you know, we're taking a lot, you know, for granted in terms of what the EU negotiating partners might agree to. So the range of options is very, very broad at this point. And, you know, we can't say for certain whether we're still going to be in the single market, for example, or the customs union. All of this has implications. So what does this mean for IT and technology? Okay, well let's kind of remember that the you know, one of the primary jobs of technology in government, certainly central government, is to deliver policy. Okay, so if it's government's policy, for example, to you know, crack down on tax avoidance, then IT systems need to support that some way. IT systems need to collect certain types of taxes at different rates. They need to dish out different types of benefits, pensions at different rates, different policies. There are, you know, 1,000,001 ways in which government IT systems deliver government policy. Now look at the landscape we're facing. We don't know what policy is going to be like. Will we still have, for example, a rural payments agency in 5–10 years? We don't know. That was an agency that was set up specifically to channel common agricultural policy money to farmers. Okay, I suspect there are a fair few civil servants who will be delighted to be shot of the RPA. But, you know, we're just going to have to wait and see. We're already seeing, for example, over at HMRC, you know, starting to think about what the implications to changes to customs might be for them. They're looking at, for example, you know, are there systems which deal with goods crossing the border? You know, if we had to suddenly reintroduce border customs check, could they scale? Now, this is a really, really practical issue, isn't it? So, you know, of course, all of these kind of changes, there are so many possibilities, we don't know what. So what are we doing? We're planning for change. We don't know what the change is going to be, but we're planning for change. And this is a really, really important message for all suppliers. Because actually, what does that mean? Does that mean that we just stay still and we do nothing for the next 5 years? You know, next 10 years, that would be quite miserable. There certainly are current investments which are being kind of put on hold while they wait for certainty. But let's think about the opportunities for change, for positive change. One, there's a kind of scoping, there's a kind of blue sky opportunity there, isn't there? The government at the moment is thinking about all of the different possibilities in terms of Brexit, and, you know, could it actually deliver on them? So, you know, if we were going to do this differently, if we were going to do agricultural subsidies differently, you know, how do we want to do it? We'd probably want a different system, a digital system. Okay, and that goes right across the board. So there's lots of opportunities for blue sky thinking about how government could work better, and that's good news for technology companies because there are always lots and lots of ideas, I find, in this community. The second opportunity is really different, and it's this. If your applications and your services, you're not really too sure what they're supposed to be doing yet, you know, the tax rules, we don't know, you know, we're just going to sit on that for a bit, then let's look at infrastructure, okay? Because the fact is that whatever the policy is on all of this stuff, we know that government needs to move to cloud. We know that government needs to get its software development house in order. You know, that move over from the kind of old outsourced approach to application development, that needs to change. We need to get those technical teams working really, really well with agile methodologies, new tools. There is so much that needs to be done. A ton of enterprise architecture work Government architecture is generally in fairly poor shape. So much has been outsourced to those big suppliers over the past 2 decades. The whole process of bringing it in-house now, for government, that's a really big deal. There's a lot of opportunity there. So, let's think about those things which don't rely on politicians. We can get them to change anyway. Another thing I wanted to mention was data, because there's a very, very big piece of work which is going to affect all public sector organisations around data protection and data governance. And there's a clear link there, isn't there, into the EU, because of course the big piece of legislation there that we're awaiting for is GDPR, which is the next EU data protection directive. Now, the fact is that whatever happens with Brexit, we will have to implement GDPR or something that looks very like it. And the reason for that is that GDPR applies if you're going to process EU citizens' data, wherever you're located. And actually, if you want to do business, any business in the EU, you still need to implement it. And then, even if we're not in the EU, you would still have to have an equivalent regime. Okay, so if you think of the way that, for example, Safe Harbour worked, that was the idea that there was kind of regulatory equivalence on both sides of the Atlantic. So, we're going to have to do GDPR, something very like it. This is especially important for public sector, because actually one of the most important, challenging, controversial issues facing the public sector at the moment is around data sharing. And this is the idea that by taking pieces of data, possibly involving citizens' personal data that sit in different parts of the public sector, bringing it together, we can do very kind of powerful things. So, for example, we can do really good fraud detection, which is probably the best application for this kind of analytics. Marrying up data, for example, from the benefit system with the tax system. What data exists in the criminal justice system. There are all sorts of possibilities, but to make that happen does require very kind of sensitive handling, because of course citizen data is very, very sensitive, and the government has a particular duty of care there. And especially when you start involving personal data from the healthcare system, we can see how challenging that is. We've already seen the demise of a major programme around data sharing in health, which is called Care Data, and that was really driven by concerns around kind of ethics of sharing and exploiting that data. So actually the need for governance frameworks to sit around data has never been stronger in the public sector. And public sector organisations just lack this expertise so badly. It isn't even just a case that their technology is dreadful, which it is, of course, by the way. But it's that kind of thinking about data, having kind of data in the blood, in the DNA. That's something which not all organisations have, and really being able to understand these frameworks and how to kind of take care of citizens' data and to share it in a very kind of structured and controlled way. That's important. And I think it's worth at this point actually just kind of going back to the fact that we have a new Prime Minister, Theresa May. What might she bring to the picture which is going to be different to her predecessors? Well, you already kind of mentioned how in comparison to Cameron and Osborne, May is very keen to kind of move beyond the idea that it's just all about kind of cuts and public service cuts. And she's very kind of keen to move on to this kind of growth-oriented story. So that's good news. And that, there may well be a bit more money kind of sloshing around, particularly for infrastructure projects, the kind of things that would drive economic growth, that would stimulate the economy. So that's good. But I think the other area which May is going to really bring to government, which is going to be a change of emphasis, is going to be around data. And that's based on our knowledge of her as Home Secretary. She was in that job for a long time, and she had such a clear agenda there around kind of exerting kind of control, which is very interesting. The Home Office under Theresa May has been really developing a number of digital programmes which have been around data collection and data exploitation. Many of them really quite not so sure shadow is the right word, but they haven't necessarily kind of made it out into the public domain. We know that border security is one of the most kind of sensitive areas, really important to get it right. A lot of fears around terrorism, so the kind of data collection going on within the Home Office family and the criminal justice system generally has been kind of quite interesting. So how might a Theresa May approach kind of be spread to the rest of government? I suspect that this kind of quite a kind of data-centric intelligence gathering approach may well crop up elsewhere, and so that's another reason why I think these issues around data are going to be so important for the technology industry. In terms of other things which might become important, another change of emphasis in Theresa May is her interest in kind of structural change driven from the centre. You might remember how one of her first acts on Prime Minister was actually to abolish a whole Whitehall department for energy and climate change, to roll it into the business department, to take universities out of biz, put them into the Department of Education. So this kind of Whitehall kind of deck chair shuffling, it's become quite unfashionable actually in Whitehall. Civil servants don't really like that kind of structural change for the sake of it. They find it very distracting. So actually to have these kind of departmental restructures was quite a bit of a blast from the past. We've also seen some interesting noises on grammar schools, for example. So again, that interest in driving structural change across the public sector from the centre, And that's something else we also saw from Theresa May at the Home Office. Similar approach, getting police forces to change the way they did things. Driving through really quite unpopular reforms from the centre. So what's the kind of takeaway for technology there? Well, structural change to public sector organisations means changes to the IT infrastructure, doesn't it? And all sorts of opportunities there to do things better, actually. So, lots of consulting, all sorts of kind of merger type considerations. But also the opportunity to look at organisations and say, well, look, is this organisation really using digital tools as effectively as it could? Are these civil servants being enabled to collaborate in a way that they should? And this goes back to that task of Brexit for the civil service, which is going to be so tough, because actually a lot of it now really rests on the shoulders of individuals. This is not something that can be delivered by changing, a few rules in a tax system. This is something which has to be negotiated and delivered between individuals, and that means if those individuals aren't working together, well, then, God help us all. I mean, it really is about, the performance of individual civil servants here, and of course their counterparts in the EU. So actually, the need for collaboration tools is really important. Any kind of technologies and services that help that kind of smart working approach, that help civil servants to kind of discover knowledge. Tools, for example, to help them sift through 40 years of legislation, which is what they're going to need to do to identify the potential impacts of Brexit on the public sector. They are literally going to have to go through 40 years of legislation. Okay, so I've talked about data protection, talked about structural change. I think I've pretty much kind of come to the end of my presentation now. I imagine when my starts working again, I'll discover that there was a brilliant extra hour in there, which you've all missed out on now. I just kind of wanted to kind of leave you with a thought, which is based on the story in the FT this morning. So Philip Hammond, the Chancellor, is at the moment engaged in an absolutely almighty political battle with kind of rival factions within the Conservative government. And this is about what happens with the customs union. Okay, so as a member of the EU, right now the UK is a member of the customs union. Now, this doesn't often get talked about. Most of us know about the single market, but the customs union, less so. The customs union is all about where our borders are in terms of customs and borders checks. Okay, within the EU, we all know that there are no border customs checks. So if you're exporting within the EU, this is brilliant news, because it means that your trucks can cross borders. They don't have to be stopped, searched. You don't have to give paperwork. And all of this is known to increase trade. They said there are calculations out there, every hour of delay at customs borders reduces trade by 5%, so it's quite significant. However, there's a school of thought that if the UK came out of the customs union, it would give us more flexibility to negotiate trade deals outside the EU. Okay, so tough choice. You know, now this is a political issue. You know, this is something which politicians are going to have to decide. But of course, the question is, would customs checks function in the same way as they do now? You know, would they involve paperwork? You know, would they involve stopping physically at the border? And so the challenge that civil servants have been set in the Treasury is, can you come up with a new digital way of implementing customs checks at the border that would not lose us 5% of trade? Now, that sounds great, but as technologists, aren't you scared? I am. I mean, can the Treasury viably kind of come up with a decent estimate? Would you trust the Treasury to scope this as an IT project? You know, when the government can't even implement kind of relatively simple changes to existing IT systems without running into multi-billion-pound, multi-year horrible failures, I think this is, you know, it's quite sort of sobering to think actually how much responsibility now is being placed on the civil service and the role of technology within that. So I hope I haven't scared you too much, but you know, just kind of final thoughts. How important is technology to the way that government runs today, and how different it is to 1973 when we went into the EU? Technology is absolutely at the heart of government now, and you know, it's not just about delivering what the politicians say. Actually, as a technology industry, we should be going to the politicians and saying, you know, we've come up with some ideas. We think you can't do it like this. We think this is going to work. You know, have you thought of that? Let's be practical. So that's it from me. Hope that was interesting. Thank you very much.